Today on Inside the Issues, I speak with Sarah Eaton on state capitalism in China. Hello and welcome to this week's edition of Inside the Issues, a CIGI online podcast. I'm David Welch, CIGI Chair of Global Security at the Balsley School of International Affairs and Professor of Political Science at the University of Waterloo. And it's my pleasure every week to welcome a guest here into the studios at the Center for International Governance Innovation to talk about some timely and important topic on the global agenda. And today, very happy to welcome my colleague, Sarah Eaton, Assistant Professor of Political Science at the University of Waterloo and a noted expert on China who's going to help us understand this superficially paradoxical concept of state capitalism. So welcome.
Thank you.
State capitalism strikes us as something that a communist country might not ordinarily be interested in. So maybe you can start by telling us a bit about what state capitalism is as opposed to non-state capitalism and perhaps how China reconciles itself to a system that seems at odds with its own legitimating principles.
Sure. Well, the conventional view of where China has been going since 1978, since the beginning of the reform period, was that what the leaders had in mind was the slow, gradual dismantling of the command economy and the building up of a market economy that would be familiar to citizens of the U.S., citizens of Northern Europe and in Canada. And that seemed to be, in fact, what was happening until about 10 or so years ago. China entered the WTO in 2001 under extremely sort of arduous conditions, involved liberalization of sensitive industries like agriculture and financial services. And so this seemed to be a very strong signal, one of many, that China was headed down to towards the road of, the complete retreat of the state from the market. And something very surprising, given that background, has happened in recent years, that the state seems to be coming back to the market in the sense of rolling out very ambitious industrial policies, in throwing a lot of weight behind big SOEs. These are state-owned enterprises. So all of this has caused people who think about Chinese political economy, my field, to ask themselves, well, was the story that we told ourselves about where China was heading, the trajectory that China was on from 1978, does that remain true? And what the sort of emerging consensus is that China has adopted a model of state capitalism, in which there's a big role for the state to play in management of the economy in various senses.
And when they started down this marketization road, did they start small scale with local markets and small producers, and then they scaled it up gradually to larger enterprises? That's
absolutely right. So the reform was a series of experiments, and on the basis of accumulated knowledge of these reform experiments, the sort of process proceeded. So reform really started in rural areas. They dismantled the communes that had been a feature of the command economy, and they allowed people, farmers, to sell some of their produce to the market. There was a dual track economy at that time, so some of the produce that people were selling, that people cultivated, was given to the state in the form of as per the planning system, and the residual surplus beyond that number could be sold on the market track. And so the sort of logic of reform in that period was about gradual expansion of the market track. So this was, again, first started in rural agriculture and was later expanded to small-scale industry in rural areas. And SOEs, large state-owned enterprises in big, heavy industries, were sort of the last piece of reform. And that was something that only began in earnest in the late 1990s and has proved to be the most difficult and sort of arduous aspect of reform.
Well, if I remember my Economics 101 textbook correctly, it's been a long time, so maybe I don't, but defined capitalism as a system in which the means of production were held privately,
right,
and could be traded, bought and sold privately. Now the state is not a private actor, it's a public actor.
Right.
So in what sense is this actually capitalism? It sounds like it's something else.
Yeah, that's a great question. So one of the words that's been applied by people who don't believe the state capitalism story is that what China has now is a system of hybrid capitalism. So these reforms, which opened up agricultural markets and which encouraged the creation of non-state enterprises in industries that are not sort of in the in the strategic sectors had the long-term effect of creating a vibrant private or at least non-state market economy in many, many sectors and in many, many regions of China. So there is the familiar sort of capitalism that you describe in many aspects of the Chinese economy. And then there's this other reality that in a certain number of strategic sectors, 7 to 10, according to how you count, the state has really sort of glommed onto these industries and maintains a very strong role in managing these particular parts of the economy. So hence you have this view held by some that China now is really a hybrid economy in which both the state capitalism story and the conventional view of capitalism both obtain.
And has the regime adjusted its legitimizing narrative at all? I mean, communism used to be about leaving capitalism and finding a way towards a utopian society in which everybody held all the means of production and benefited from them according to need rather than according to ability or skill.
Yeah. Well, there are doctrinaire communists in China who argue now that China in fact needed to go through the capitalist stage of development to reach the communist, the first socialist and then communist endpoint that Marx envisioned, right? So that this was all put off by the 1949 revolution, right? And that this was an inevitable stage, and so they could be heading towards some form of communism. That's one view. The sort of pragmatic view held by Deng Xiaoping and most of the people in the top echelons of the leadership today is that the experiment with the command economy just didn't quite work, and now they've adopted a form of market economy. The official term for it is a socialist market economy. This was adopted in the early 1990s as the sort of official doctrine. And there's much sort of snickering within China about the contradictions that this implies, especially because China today, after a series of privatizations, lacks a strong social safety net for many people who are sort of vulnerable to these changes in the economy. So there's some sort of irony to that. But the long-term view is that when they are in the process of rolling out more adequate health insurance schemes and pension schemes. So that's in the effort to make this sort of socialist aspect of the socialist market economy a reality.
Oh, I see. Yeah. Fascinating. Well, we'll be back in a minute with Sarah Eaton. You're watching or listening to Inside the Issues, the CIGI Online podcast. Look for us at cgonline.org, on Facebook, on Twitter, and on YouTube. Welcome back. So you described a process whereby China entered the WTO and then moved sort of aggressively towards the state-owned enterprise model, which involved, I gather, creating a lot of national champions, which I'd like to talk about in a minute. Is that generally seen as a retreat from WTO commitments, or is there a story that they tell that makes it sound like it's all part of the process?
In the eyes of many of China's major trade partners, this is certainly a retreat from the WTO commitments. So bankers in China were very excited at the prospect of these big promises to liberalize the financial sector that were associated with WTO entry. And so, the city banks of the world were readying to roll out new branches all over China. And what happened when you talk to people about the ins and outs of sort of entering this market today, while on paper they have what's called national treatment under the WTO rules. In practice, when one wants to open up a new commercial banking center in a major, let's say Shanghai or Beijing, there's just an endless raft of regulations. So one person described this as kind of like effort to slice up the salami, right? It just, you make so many steps that the whole thing ends up being quite impossible, or at least unattractive for people who want to enter the market. So that's, there's been a lot of pressure from China's trade partners to honor the terms of particularly the services agreement more faithfully. Now, of course, this was prior to 2008 when the financial crisis happened. This seemed to their sort of what they would describe as a prudential approach to implementation of the WTO agreements on financial services. This seemed to sort of legitimize the cautious approach. So now banking regulators, central bankers in China are feeling very comfortable with this cautious approach, and they feel like they have legitimacy in allowing things to change very, very slowly. So that's one view. In many other people's eyes, even within China, the government has used this as an excuse to sort of prop up the SOEs. So 2008 was a sort of convenient cover for policies that had a different aim, if you will. Yeah.
Now, national champions are a big part of this version, this kind of state capitalism we see in China now.
Yeah.
So what are the specific national champions in China, and why has the regime chosen some rather than others?
Yeah. So the big state-owned national champions are clustered in a series of strategic sectors. Certainly oil and gas, so PetroChina, CNOOC are the big players, are the big national champions in oil and gas. In airlines and telecommunications, these are the two industries that I focus on. Air China is the biggest player in the airlines market. China Mobile is the sort of behemoth in the telecommunications market. Shipping is another industry where the national champions strategy is big. Auto is as well. So these are all designated, although not clearly, but we can think of them as designated strategic sectors. And in these designated strategic sectors, the state has decided to cultivate primarily state-owned national champions. And this comes, my research is really about sort of uncovering the origins of this approach. So, as I said, the conventional view of China was that China was engaged in this very gradual and very intricate process of the state retreating from the market, of gradual marketization. And as I said, the last piece and the most difficult piece of this process was the privatization of state-owned enterprises. And this only began in the late 1990s. And in the end, the sort of non-privatization of many of these large SOEs came as a surprise to some people. And my research is really interested in how this came to pass. And my sort of what I've learned from archival research and from interviews with retired government officials primarily is that this was actually a plan that this plan to cultivate national champions in oligopolistic industries in key areas was something that dates back to at least the early 1990s. So my research is interested in sort of tracing the development of this national champions strategy, if you will.
And the idea is for the state to retain the benefits of, I suppose, inflated margins in the sales of these products and services.
Yeah, so that's the sort of cynic's view of it, and certainly some people would argue that that's exactly what's going on, that this is sort of rent-seeking. Others have argued that there's a different sort of economic basis to this. So they were thinking about the work of people like Alfred Chandler and learning from the developmental state about the importance of having large corporations in key industries, in oligopolistic industries in which there's not a whole lot of competition. This was really important for national development as well as playing in the big leagues. That is, when the markets are liberalized, it's important to have these big players in order to compete with the Microsofts of the world. So that was the kind of on paper economic logic of these choices. But
which of those two views do you favor?
Honestly, I see the merits of both, and I think that they're in the work that I'm doing. I frame them not as either or propositions, because I think that's inaccurate. So in my view, there were a group of high-ranking officials who really bought into the sort of lessons of the developmental state and the importance of having these national champions, and they created these policies to do just that. But institutions go in places that you can't predict, right? There are both intended and unintended consequences of doing that. And what you see now in these industries, which I've mentioned, airlines, telecommunications, oil and gas, is just really sort of off-the-scale corruption. And that's probably something that these people, thinking about the advantages of having these big players for national and global development, just couldn't foresee.
Right. But wouldn't China's generally low factor costs make these big enterprises highly competitive internationally anyway, even if?
Yeah.
even if left to their own devices?
Yeah, well, but then these are state-owned enterprises, right? I mean,
Right.
now many of them have portions of their equity listed on overseas stock markets. So there's, in some sense, they have been sort of partially privatized, and these were partially privatized in the interest of giving them sort of boost in terms of economic incentives to inspire them to maximize profits. But at base, these are still relics from the command economy in some sense, right? Notions of efficiency and notions of profit maximization, these are things that are hard to transplant into state-owned enterprises. And so the state has tried to do that sort of by administrative fiat. And in some people's eyes, they've been successful. China Mobile, for example, is quite a well-run corporation, and less successful in other cases.
Really interesting. Thank you very much for that clarification. Be back again with Sarah Eaton. You're watching or listening to Inside the Issues, a CIGI online podcast. Look for us at cgionline.org, on Facebook, on Twitter, and on YouTube. Welcome back. Other countries have national champions. The U.S. has Boeing. We have Air Canada. They're privately held, privately traded companies, but there is still a logic about national championism there. What distinguishes Chinese national champions from American or Canadian national champions?
That's an excellent question. Well, the people who are sort of less optimistic about China's approach to creating these national champions would argue that along the way that the process made them didn't set them up well to be very competitive players in global markets. And that's because and in the effort to, one of the sort of key phrases that the state uses to describe its effort to build up national champions is going big and going strong. 做大做强. And in the process of implementing this, there was a lot of emphasis put on going big, that is, enlarging the scale of these enterprises. And they did that by, there were various numbers of methods, but a lot of it involved sort of forced mergers and acquisitions between various different players within a single market, because there was a lot of fragmentation in a lot of these markets in which SOEs are now big players. So they sort of essentially lumped together a whole bunch of little players to form a big sort of wannabe national champion. And one of the downsides of this approach is that when you lump in sort of the good with the bad, you sort of dilute you end up with a product which isn't in some ways all that attractive. So there was a lot in the process of molding these national champions which hampered them.
And the industrial policy behind all this is a distinctively Chinese kind of industrial policy? Is it?
Yeah. So in some sense, what China was doing was as I said before, learning from the developmental states, right? They sent lots of delegations to Japan, to South Korea, to Singapore to find out about the ins and outs of industrial policy, because those are obviously some of the best examples we have in the post-war period of successful experiments with industrial policy. The particular timing of when China embraced this big national champion strategy for state-owned enterprises is quite interesting, and that's one of the things that my work focuses on. It was embraced in the period right after the Tiananmen uprising in 1989. Between 1989 and 1992, if you will, the opponents of Deng, people who were opposed to this gradual marketization reform trajectory that Deng had set in place, held the reins in economic policy. And they used this sort of 2.5-year period to create the institutional foundations of this national champion strategy. And when you read the documents related to this period, it's quite clear that they thought of this as an important political step in addition to an economic step. So there was this economic logic, but there was a very clear and evident political logic as well, which is that they were concerned about the political implications of a growing private sector. And they wanted to sort of check the growth of the private sector and make sure that there were some big lucrative industries which they could continue to control.
So they were worried about alternative centers of potential political power emerging in the private sector.
Exactly that, yeah.
And bought these people off.
And bought these people off and created really high barriers to entry in the most prized industries so that they could never enter them.
Now, what about the role of the PLA, People's Liberation Army? That's in some people's view, a very large commercial organization.
Mm.
Does that fit into this industrial policy in any way? Is it
Yeah.
sort of an accidental player?
The People's Liberation Army, especially for the first 2 decades of reform, was a huge player in state-owned industry. There was a big reform under sort of reform-minded leader, Zhu Rongji, in the late 1990s, and he was interestingly the only one-term premier in the post-war, in the reform period since 1978, and he was very unpopular with special interests like the PLA because he forced the PLA out of business nominally. So they were big players in various state-owned industries and had to give up these assets and sell them off to other people. So that was a big change. The PLA after that reform certainly wasn't as big a player in state-owned industries as it had been previously. But now the sort of consensus view, although it's very hard to get good data on this, they've gone underground, right? So they're still huge players in the state-owned industry, but you just can't see them.
I see.
Yeah.
Oh, interesting. Well, we'll be back one last time with Sarah Eaton. You're watching or listening to Inside the Issues, the CIGI Online podcast. Look for us at cgionline.org, on Facebook, on Twitter, and on YouTube. Welcome back. So one of the things that occupies my time as a global security person is rising tensions between China and its neighbors, particularly Japan at the moment, over useless islands in the East China Sea. And also China has been, I think most people would say, pretty successful in cozying up to Taiwan. There's less cross-strait tension than there used to be, in part because there's much more economic interaction. So I'm curious to know how Chinese state capitalism and a very sort of self-conscious Chinese industrial policy that features national champions works with Japan being the number one foreign investor in China and willingly investing vast sums of money and setting up production there. And how does it work with Taiwanese interests, and does it have any kind of real impact on pro-independence sentiment in Taiwan, or attitudes in China towards the proper way to manage the Taiwanese issue? Seems to me if it's all market-driven, this would be fairly straightforward. I mean, the money would follow the factor costs and the returns and so forth and so on. But when it's large state-owned enterprises on the Chinese side, one would have to think that these other players must suspect that there are other agendas at work and would be suspicious about playing ball with China this way.
Yeah, I mean, we see that in Canada as well, right? All this hand-wringing about whether the big SOE should be allowed to invest in the tar sands, right? It's the same sort of set of concerns. As you know, China and Japan do a massive amount of trade with one another, and this is where we have to remind ourselves that while the sort of sectors that I focus on are very characterized by national champion strategy, have high barriers to entry, are essentially sort of hands off for all but the 3 or 4 players within the market. Much of the Chinese economy is wide open, right?
Oh, okay.
So you think about textiles or electronics. These are industries that are in which there isn't a very strong national champion strategy, and so therefore there's still lots of investment and opportunities for China's trade partners in these other industries. But as I said before, the U.S. in particular has been quite disappointed with China's approach to implementation of the Agreement on Financial Services, which is obviously very relevant to this. Banks are another industry in which there's a very obvious national champion strategy. So it continues to irk China's trade partners. In the integration, I mean, it's the sort of conventional logic about the benefits of economic integration for political ties meets a really hard sort of test in East Asia, as you know, right? The conventional sort of common sense view is that once you trade butter, you put down your guns, and this obviously is very problematic when you think about the China and Japan case. So the conventional view of China-Japan relationship, as you know, is that it's characterized by hot economics and cool politics, and I think one of the things that people have hoped for, that the hot economics will eventually win over cool politics and make them hot as well. And that just hasn't happened over time. And in fact, now we see increasing polarization on two sides. So I think for students of international political economy, this is a really interesting case to look at. In Taiwan, of course, that's also a very complex political situation. The two parties that represent have very different views on what approach Taiwan should take to unification with China. And again, this is one of those cases where increasing economic links between the two countries don't necessarily lead to warmer politics. So it remains to be seen, I think.
So what about the rest of the world? They must see all of this as highly uncompetitive practice or anti-competitive practice in some way. Why don't we hear more about this? Is it that people have their own skeletons in their industrial policy closets and they don't want to draw attention to them? Or are they actually perfectly happy with their economic relations with China on balance?
Well, I think the world has changed radically since 2008 in terms of, to some degree, China, it looked as though China for 25 years was following the tenets of the Washington Consensus pretty closely, in a gradual way, but nevertheless, the aims were largely parallel. And when you talk to people in China and in policy wonks elsewhere, the rug really seems to have come out from under this view of the world, or view of the appropriate role of states vis-a-vis markets, right? So the massive bailouts that we saw in many parts of the world after 2008 and the increasing role for the state in not only China but other places seems to have given state capitalism a new legitimacy, especially in the developing world. So there's been a lot of talk, as you know, about whether China has a model to offer the rest of the developing world. And ironically, although for 20, 25 years, the trajectory seemed to be about marketization, seemed to be about gradual implementation of the Washington Consensus. Now we have this more robust state managing the economy, and those seem to be the lessons that China is interested in exporting elsewhere. So that's quite interesting.
Mm-hmm. We've had a lot of headlines recently about Chinese industrial espionage and cyber warfare type activities.
Yeah.
Is this beginning to make people rethink the whole Chinese state-owned enterprise model and whether it might pose a broader kind of security risk?
That's another great question and a difficult one to answer. I think absolutely this feeds those who have worries about the investments coming from the oil and gas sector, or especially into technology in other parts of the world, are certainly concerned about this. But I think we have to remind ourselves that it's not many of the companies involved in IT sort of don't have a real clean conscience. Like Cisco, for example, was involved in setting up a lot of the hardware which governments in China use to monitor citizens' communications online.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think it's a really murky picture, and certainly this is cause for concern.
Mm. Well, it's a complicated and evolving story, I suppose, isn't it? And it'll be interesting to see how it unfolds over the next few years and whether or not these hard security issues spill over into these international political economy kind of issues. But
Absolutely.
Thanks for helping shed a little light on state capitalism in China for us. And to our audience, thank you for joining us, and join us again next week for another episode of Inside the Issues, the CIGI Online podcast. Look for us at cgionline.org, on Facebook, on Twitter, and on YouTube.